Picture this. You're neck deep in a collection of African folk tales or ethnographic commentary written by some 19th century ethnographer when, after a detailed exposition on, say, marital customs, you find yourself faced with a block of Latin text. Curious. Why would an Englishman, perfectly capable as demonstrated in the hundreds of other pages in the book, choose to write in Latin in a book destined for an English speaking audience? Stick around to find out in this week's Mythological Africans podcast. Hello, friends, and welcome to the Mythological Africans podcast, where we read and talk about stories from African mythology and folklore. I am your host, Helen Tunde. I'll admit the first time I encountered this phenomenon, it didn't even register past the archaic English and the prejudice that are the hallmark of so many books from those eras. You see, I was raised Catholic, and the part of Cameroon where I grew up follows the British education and legal system. So Latin has always been that familiar toga clad figure floating in the background of my consciousness, watching besuited English and French trample over the Togu of Chufie, the language spoken in my village, while Pidgin, the real lingua franca of the region, clad in probably okrika or secondhand jeans and an Ankara blouse, laughed at them all. But it kept showing up in paragraphs within the text itself, in footnotes stuck at the bottom of the page, in appendices, just about everywhere. And I always wondered if it was some kind of archaic citation form, but I didn't even bother to look into it. And then one day, a friend and fellow scholar of mythology and folklore cracked a joke about how squeamish European scholars, British ones especially, would use Latin, a scholarly language usually known only by other men, to record things they feared would be too scandalous for the women and children in their audiences. Suddenly, a fascinating new world opened up. I'll stop here for a content warning. This episode will broach topics of a sexual nature, so I do not recommend it for listeners under legal age in any place where this podcast is available. Back to regularly scheduled programming. I've always thought one of the most hilariously ironic things about European and specifically British colonization of the rest of the world is that most of it happened during the Victorian era when cultural norms were so moralistic and rigid, people were called mentally ill for expressing the most basic desires for emotional or psychological freedom. Imagine that coming up against different indigenous communities in which people use their bodies, their voices, their imaginations, and everything available to them to communicate their aliveness. Understanding and harmonious integration was really never an option, if you ask me. A great example of this is Quomodo evenit ut penis primum cum vagina coit. This is an ecom story of how the sexual act came to be, and the ecom people are found in southeastern Nigeria, if I'm not mistaken. It was recorded by British colonial administrator Elphinstone Dayrell and published in his 1913 book, Ecom Folk Stories from Southern Nigeria. To summarize briefly, penis and vagina are neighbors. Penis loves vagina, but has not made her aware. One day, penis is hungry and asks vagina for palm nuts to eat. She agrees, but requests that he agrees to pay her back. Penis agrees to her terms, but when Vagina comes to collect a couple of days later, Penis refuses to hold up his end of the bargain. Vagina raises hell and in the process cuts herself open. When she starts bleeding, she alarms Penis, who turns to his good friend Testicles for help. Testicles gives Penis a liquid which he is to put into Vagina. And the liquid and the act of insertion is so soothing, Vagina begs Penis to come back every night. And so they carry on, unless Vagina doesn't feel well or is in a bad mood. Now, this story occurs at the end of Elphinstone Darrell's book and is told completely in Latin because of its sexual nature. And you can find a link to the English translation in the episode notes. But what's interesting about the story is that in addition to being funny and a pretty spot on assessment of relational dynamics, it's also fairly biologically accurate. I imagine a story such as this being told to a group of giggling adolescents as part of their induction into adulthood. That's better sex education than the sizable number of young people get in 2024. Edwin William Smith and Andrew Murray Dale, who published their in depth study of the Ila-speaking people in Zambia in 1919, also used Latin notes extensively in their book. As a matter of fact, the Ila-speaking peoples of northern Rhodesia is one of the first books in which I encountered this phenomenon. Interestingly, the Ila had very particular rules for sex, even amongst married couples. So the section on marriage in the book is just liberally sprinkled with Latin paragraphs and sentences and footnotes. And what's striking is that apparently back in the day, the Ila were really into plucking pubic hair. And this is something that fell to the wives to do for their husbands. And so, as Smith and Bill recorded, a soon to be wed girl would be sat down by an elderly woman and told, so and so, you are to be married. Remember that a man is to be obeyed and his food cooked. And when people come to pay a visit, do not hide your face, but receive them warmly and hospitably. When you have people in the house, treat them kindly. And if your mother in law sends you on an errand, be quick in starting, for they are to be honored. Food is to be ground for them, water drawn for them, and they are always to be answered respectfully. And in your house, things are to be done nicely. The pots are to be kept clean and in good condition, and the house is to be swept within, and your husband is to be obeyed implicitly and not answered angrily. When you are married, do not act childishly. You are to provide food. Oh, woman, cook well and do not spoil the food. You are to be perfect in cooking. Ver etiam purgandus et lavandus ex ist, capillo pubis evulso. Translation is also in the episode notes. Now, Ila gender roles are what they are, so we will not delve into any of that. What I find fascinating are the grooming practices, and there are many such examples under different circumstances, all in Latin, of course. What's great about this practice is that one gets a bit of a content warning, right? So if I'm reading one of these texts and I see Latin, I know things are about to get spicy at best or truly shocking at worst. And things did get shocking. Like other societies across the world, traditional African societies had their fair share of questionable to completely unacceptable practices, many of which were recorded in the Latin notes. And this makes me think of the time when we did live storytelling Twitter space sessions on MA's X account. And usually I would read the stories beforehand to get an idea of what we would talk about. But other times I would want to experience the novelty of the story with everyone else, so I wouldn't read these stories beforehand. And let's just say I wish I had Latin inserts and notes to warn me when things were about to get weird. But we survived those times and we're still here. And that being said, the Latin section and notes, to me, they really are like the reality TV equivalent of these books and research papers. And let me explain what I mean here. I don't really watch reality TV. And to be honest, I don't watch any TV. I don't even own a TV. But what I do know about reality shows comes from social media commentary, literary analysis, and the odd clip here and there. Reality TV in their dramatizations and exaggerations and teasing or outright dancing with the salacious, the scandalous, and the sensational, actually ends up exploring and highlighting some of the most interesting and essential aspects of the human psyche and relational dynamics. This, in my opinion, is exactly what happens when European explorers use Latin notes to discuss certain aspects of African cultures. Their attempt at discretion ends up drawing critical attention to these topics and, in the process, emphasizes their own baggage, for lack of a better term. The Latin notes make for fascinating reading all the same, so if reading centuries old ethnographic and anthropological texts are your thing, I definitely encourage you to check them out. And that brings us to the end of this week's episode. We'll be back next week with more African mythology and folklore.